We are founded in Perth, 2016, and our mission really is to positively impact more than 1 billion lives through better learning and training. And the way we do that is by providing the Facilitate platform, which allows everyday people, learning professionals, operational trainers, to create immersive content easily and quickly, and just provide learning experiences that have a lot more impact and are a lot more engaging than is often the case these days. Mark, do you want to speak to this, or do you want me to
go ahead?
Through it?
I'll let you go through some of that.
Yeah, I'll see how I go.
All
so
right.
This is Mark. Mark is from Work Pics 360. He's a Google Street View trusted commercial photographer, specializing, as I said, in 360-degree virtual tours. So I think you described yourself as the little orange peg man. Is that correct, Mark?
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, it's the simplest way for people to go. If you've ever seen Pegman on Google Maps, that's essentially what I create.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you. So he's done some work for some nice names here: Planet Fitness, Crown Plaza, Worthington BMW, and many, many more. So he also provides 360-degree rotating imagery, commercial and product photography as well for web and print, and virtual reality, of course. So that's the connection with Facilitate. Mark's a member of the International Virtual Reality Photographers Association, and he's on the board of the Central Coast Tourism. Fantastic. So anything to add there, Mark?
That's a pretty good start, I think. If you're like, probably can just get right into it so we can get people.
Yeah.
Now, I think you have did you actually go through a survey with everyone yet?
I did. I have a couple of questions. I'll just quickly put those up, just so we're making sure we're getting everyone's interests covered here. So I've just launched that survey. That should pop up on your Zoom screen, guys. So if you can please fill that in, that would be great. We just want to get a bit of a sense of what you're using the technology for, and so we can focus that a little bit. So there's one more question after this. As soon as we've got this one, then we'll jump in. So that would be fantastic.
Yeah. And while people are answering these questions, keep in mind, everyone, that this is a session for you. So if you have things that you want to ask or that haven't been covered, or please make sure you bring them up, because my interest is in helping you get to the point of making better decisions in the process of the image capture.
Fantastic. Yeah, no, absolutely, guys. Just speak up and as we go through. Okay. So I think we might leave that one there. So the majority there on that one was the second one was to capture a procedure or a task for training at 54%. And then 18% was the first one, the location-based training or that virtual tour piece. And then the other two were equally tied at 14%. So fairly strong on the second one. Cool. So this is the last question before we get into it. Let me just launch that as well. There we go. So this is just asking you what you want to use the imagery for. Again, that'll help us shape it a little bit as we go through, and we'll see how much ground we cover. But otherwise, Mark, if you're happy, we might even get you to come back another time and maybe do a more focused session.
Absolutely. This is, if anything, I think that this is probably exactly that, a preliminary session to help people understand essentially what is the lay of the land in the decision-making process. And then we may want to look at how do we regroup particular, whether it be, because I know that you have a lot of people in the room today that are in the education space, and the needs for education might be slightly different than industrial manufacturing. So making sure that we address the nuances of each one of those groups. Yeah,
no, fantastic. So that'll be great. And okay, so we'll end that one there. So we've got overwhelmingly 68% is for the top one, creating VR content for learning and education, and then followed by 31% of the second one, creating e-learning content, and a small proportion for entertainment and exploratory purposes. So that's great. Thank you, audience, for that. We'll jump right on.
Cool.
And hand over to Mark. So I'll turn my screen share off and I'll let you take that away.
Okay. All right. So you'll just need to,
there we
are. Super.
Yep,
okay,
and I'll highlight you. Yep.
All right. So again, thank you very much for having me on today. Really appreciate you, Ben. And and team, everyone at Facilitate has been very, very kind to me for inviting me to do this. I'd like to first start by like what you're seeing in the background, by the way. I'm actually running on a green screen, and I'll just show you that this is definitely green screen time. And the reason why I'm doing this is so that it's a little more interesting than the average PowerPoint presentation to start with. And think in terms of the fact that immersion really comes in many, many different ways. And we're using virtual reality, virtual tours, 360 content, 360 video, probably for the most part in very, very small ways, but it's much broader than you might think. And this is really, but most people get stuck usually because the technology gets in the way. They start off with something like this over here. This is a 360 camera, and I'll be talking some more about this shortly, which is the typical consumer level 360 camera. This is the Insta360 1X3, and it's it's great quality. It's simple to use. The vast majority of the content you're going to see online on YouTube and that kind of thing is going to be shot with something like that. And in many cases, it might just be enough. But what we're going to be talking about really is about knowing how do you know when it's not enough, or when you run into a challenge with quality or standards or production processes. So let me just switch over now to the presentation. So I'm going to go over to the presentation, but I'm actually going to move it just so that it's just the presentation and not me at this moment. Okay, all right. So cool. Deciding basically what you should invest in terms of tools really is a matter of understanding what your end game is, what your final goal is. So if we go here, all right, go to the next one. Okay, so what are you trying to achieve with your 360 content? Not every virtual tour or 360 VR training or learning management system requires the same sets of visual data. And I do call it data because this kind of imagery, is wonderful as it is, it's utilitarian, right? I mean, you have to think about it in terms of how are you going to get an outcome? And then the next step is understanding what are your current skills in this space. In fact, actually, one of the questions I'd like to know, if you can maybe, we can ask this and maybe somewhat poll that as we go, even just pop your comments in the chat. How many people here in the room are already avid photographers and already have experience in using a 360 camera? I'd be curious to know if a lot of people have actually used these things. And for that matter, something a little bit more traditional in the 360 space, which is, if you're dealing with 360 cameras a lot or fisheye lenses, then you'll find this what I'll be talking about more of like a friendly reminder, or sort of like a checklist of things to do. The cost of acquisition of basically of the skills is really a matter of investment of time. The difference between a high quality virtual tour or high quality imagery and acceptable is actually very much in the law of diminishing returns. So I think in terms of thinking of, could you actually produce something very quickly that is very usable? Absolutely, yes. Most people can go to the local J-Car or camera house or whatever and buy one of these, the small 360 cameras, and start shooting right away. And you'll get things that might just be good enough to get you going. But it's when you start getting to that next level, right? When you start saying, okay, all right, I've got to up my game. I've got to shoot something that's a little more complicated. For example, something that's going to be a transition from indoor to outdoor or a very dark space, okay? So those are the things that we're going to be considering as we go along. The risks associated with shooting in-house is really, why I call it really a risk, is you can get yourself down a lot of rabbit holes with this. All right, it's very, very easy to find yourself saying, oh, this is really cool, shooting tons and tons of content, only to find out that you shot for 2 days worth of content and you're using basically like 3 images because there was a lack of planning. So really spending a lot of time planning, and this is where the team at Facilitate can probably help you an awful lot in ensuring that before you start a project, think clearly about what the final objectives are, okay? And then obviously the advantage of shooting in-house is once you have the skills, then it's much easier to do updates. More than anything else, it's all about the simplicity of doing future updates or changes. Every training program that you have, I'm sure, or content piece that you're going to have over time will age. Either the scene changes, the people that are in it, if there's people in it, will change, and you may need to change it. So keep that in mind in terms of really when you're actually considering how you're going to go about the collection process of imagery. Does it make more sense to do it in-house? Does it make more sense to just hire it out? How much time is it going to take you to learn how to do this? What are all the costs? And that's what we're going to be covering now. So a couple of definitions that I want to cover. People, you wouldn't believe how many times I come to see a client for the first time, and they say, yeah, can you get that 3D VR 360 virtual video thing going for me? And it's like, they have no idea what it is. So they call it everything under they just throw all the acronyms they can at it because they just don't know what it is. And fact is that there are some very, very distinct definitions that are important to keep in mind. And VR virtual reality was essentially the very first variation or version of this that came out back in, I remember seeing my very first VR experience in the late 90s. That's how long it's been around. Augmented reality came out a lot later, and it is in fact the concept of adding content on top of any form of visual asset. That's where you're augmenting reality. Mixed is where you're actually doing both. So understanding those three differences is pretty important. Okay. The next one is 3D versus 2D. It's important to remember that most of the content that you see today is 2D. Why? Well, it's a heck of a lot simpler to shoot. You're actually shooting less than half of the content, and your production time for 2D content compared to 3D content is like 10%. 3D adds that much more work to it. So if ever you have someone saying, can I have some 3D content? Really ask yourself, why? Is 3D absolutely necessary? All right. And 3D only exists if you actually use a 3D content creation capture process. None of the equipment I use is 3D, none. And people will call it 3D, but it's not. It's actually 2D. 360 simply means spherical content, and spherical meaning that no matter where you look, no matter where you turn around, there's content there. It's never blank. Otherwise, what you may end up with is, for example, recently Canon came out with a dual fisheye 3D lens, but it's 180. It only faces in one direction. Does it classify as VR? Yes, it does. Can it be used for AR? Yes, it can. But is it 360? No, which means you aren't really fully immersed in the environment. You're controlling the environment field of view. And there's advantages and disadvantages of that. And then finally, to touch on the topic of virtual tours, the reason why I want to throw this in there is because, quite simply, that's what I do. I am a virtual tour photographer. So, and I'm not a virtual tour videographer either, although I've been asked to do some video, and that's occasionally one of the things I supply. The difference between video and photo, again, you're adding a huge amount of additional editing and processing involved in getting something that looks good and that works. The difference is quite dramatic. Okay. We're going to also talk a little bit about photography jargon. So if at any point in time, you guys, if anyone has a question having to do with what something is, if I say something that doesn't make any sense, please stop and ask the question. All right. And then we'll talk about editing jargon, which is also another area that, again, there's a whole bunch of editing jargon. If anyone who's ever used DaVinci Resolve or Photoshop or anything like that, you'll know that in the world of editing, you can really get stuck in the weeds with making sure that the jargon is right. And then there's obviously industry jargon, right? And then there's your own internal industry jargon, making sure that everybody knows what they're talking about, especially when you're putting together a work brief. Get that right, so that if I actually say you need 16 nodes to cover this space, you'd actually know what I mean by a node. That's a virtual tour word. And that simply means the amount of times that I drop the camera in a spot and take photos all the way around to create a 360 photo. So that's the term that's used in industry for each time you stop to take an additional image is a node. Okay. All right. So some foundational knowledge in the photography and video space. Remember that basically photography is writing with light. That's what it means by definition. So when we write with light, with photography, what we're doing is we're stopping time in a single moment. Why is video so much more complicated? Well, you're taking between 24 to 50 photos per second and adding audio to it. So that's exactly why video is far more complex. Okay, so keep that difference in mind. Another one of these foundational things is an understanding of photography is the exposure triangle. Now, the exposure triangle, if you're not familiar with it, is essentially the three elements that controls quality of imagery and controls essentially what we see in the end, which is essentially how bright the image is, all right, which is essentially controlled primarily through two tools, which is essentially how long the exposure is done. So the more light you let in by having a longer exposure. And then there's also the ISO, which basically what that does is it controls the sensitivity of the sensor on the camera. So that's one side of it. Then there's also the aperture will also control how far things are in focus. So that's another factor that you have to consider. Okay, so these are things that when you're actually considering photography or this, if you're not familiar with these things, it's good to get your knowledge around exposure triangle clear. The other thing that's one of those words that's used often, and I actually put the correct way of saying it on here, is no parallax point. And that deals specifically in with the world of 360 content creation. Often people call it the nodal point, and there is no such thing as a nodal point. The no parallax point is the place at which basically, and let me just switch back to screen over here for a quick second. I'll pop myself back on. So if you actually cover one eye, all right, and then you cover the other eye, you'll notice that the things in front of you have moved around. And essentially the reason why that happens is because our eyes are a little bit further apart, and that's what gives us depth of field and distance. So what we really have to think about with that is if you actually want all of your photos to be so that the things behind the image don't move around, you have to shoot from what's called the no parallax point. Okay, so that's what that means. Is the no parallax point is that basically how to ensure that the scene's backgrounds don't overlap each other. All right. Okay. Composition, gee whiz, you know, it's photography and videography. You have to set the scene. You have to know what the scene looks like. You know, let's just imagine where it is, you know, it's an industrial space and you're trying to teach someone how to turn on and off a bunch of valves. Well, you know, how are you going to set that? Is it lit properly? Will are there little tags that people have to write down the last time they did the, you know, the check on it? You actually have to think of all these things in the scene. Can it be seen by the camera from the camera angle? Like if there's a person in it, are they in front of that? So if so, you got to change the camera angle or change the person's angle. So you really have to think about composing your scene correctly before you shoot. All right. The other thing too is to remember that in the end, what we're trying to do is create utilitarian content. All right. So that's the foundation of what 360 content is in this space. But at the same time, unless you tell a good story, it's probably not that interesting. So think more in terms of how you're going to be able to help people understand the outcome. And you can do that probably a little bit more in video, but it's surprising how much you can do it with photo if you set the scene correctly.
That's a good point. And I might just quickly jump in here, Mark. This is
Sure.
something that we, that's sort of speaking a little bit more to the learning design point of view. And we'll certainly help with our starter pack that we're offering. We've got quite a lot of support in there around storyboarding. And as you said, creating a narrative that draws people in is part of making, you know, the VR content engaging. So that's certainly something we can help with as well.
That's right.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah. Cool. All right. So what are some of the biggest challenges? The biggest challenge you have with 360 content is where do you hide the crew, right? Where do you put people? If they're in 360, there's no way of doing that if you're shooting with a camera that shoots in 360 all the time, all the way around, which is what happens in the case of 360 video. You literally have to leave the room if you're the photographer. That means that you have to hide not just yourselves, but you have to hide your lighting. You have to hide your microphones. You have to hide everything that can't be seen because it would spoil the experience. So that's number one. All right. So how do you control that? Well, basically a lot of planning. And the other one is quite simply, don't shoot 360 video and shoot a 2D photo in frames. And I'll talk a little bit more about why I choose to go that way, because of how that allows you to control me, the crew. All right. And, when I say what could possibly go wrong, you wouldn't believe how many times people have actually thought, oh, I really want to create 360 content. And then they realize that everything they shoot, they can't solve because of the fact that they haven't thought about this crew issue or lighting issue. Okay. So I think what we can do now is we're going to go into a little bit of show and tell. I'll show you some of the camera equipment that's actually out there that's often referred to in the world of 360. And I'll also show you the equipment that I use and sort of the pros and cons of why I make the choices that I do. So, okay, all right. So let me just bring myself back up over here. Okay. Whoops, wrong one. Hang on a second over here. We go here and there it is. There I am. There I am. Okay, so we'll start from the basics, which is one-shot cameras. Okay, 360 one-shot cameras. This is an example of two different 360 one-shot cameras. This one over here is an old one called the Theta V. It's one of the original ones. It shoots at roughly about 5.7K. So if you think in video terms, what that is, it's actually 4K for video, but the 5.7K is for the photos that it takes. To translate that in terms of image size, I think this is a good place to talk about that, is what does the human eye see? The human eye sees at roughly 16K. So if you're looking to reproduce images that look lifelike, and that gives you some room for what everyone does, which is pinch and zoom. Everyone, if you're going to use your mobile device, the only time you probably don't do pinch and zoom is probably on a headset, if you're using a VR headset, right? But everyone else is going to do it on desktop, whatever the case is. So you need a lot of resolution to get that kind of quality. These cameras really, well, this one doesn't give you that capability. So if you've got an older 360 camera and you're trying to create this content, I consider this to be excellent for proof of concept or places where if you damage the camera, you don't care. Good enough. Okay. So these small, less expensive $300, $400, $500 units, that's all they're really going to be good for. And there's going to be other limitations to it in terms of, how long the charge lasts, how much you can store on it, and that kind of thing. The next model up, this one over here, is the Insta360 X3, which I mentioned before. It's deceptive with the technology here that in Insta360 says, and it's true, it's a 72 megapixel camera, which creates a 12K image. And people think, my goodness, isn't that getting really close to ideal vision for the human eye? Well, there's a problem with that. And the problem is that we have to think about how big the sensor inside this camera is. All right, so if I show you this camera over here, and there's a little sensor in here, and it's a 1/2 inch, okay? Compare that to, let's just grab this, I'll grab this camera over here. So this over here is a standard 360 rig that I normally shoot with. The sensor in this camera, if I actually just take this off, over here, you'll see that on the inside, that sensor is what's called a full frame sensor, which is basically, it's massive. Like you fit the whole camera in there, practically. So the amount of the difference that happens between this camera and this camera, regardless of how many megapixels, is the ability to gather light because the sensor is larger. All right. So what makes it so that this is a much better way to go from a quality perspective has to do with the size of the pixels. So even though this is 72 megapixels, this camera is 26 megapixels. It's a Canon EOS RP. It's just a consumer camera, but it's 26 megapixels on a sensor. The difference is that the amount of light that each one of the pixels picks up is far, far broader, much more to like what the human eye can see. The human eye can actually tell roughly about 16 to 20 stops of light. Here we go with the jargon. So a stop of light is what that is basically imagine a very, very dark room and a very, very bright room. And you know how you can turn your head and look into a really dark space and turn your head and look into a really bright space. And you'll actually be able to still see reasonably well in that space. Cameras can't do that. And they can't do that, especially when you get into these small little cameras like this one, because the sensor's pixels are so small, it can't gather light.
So quickly there, Mark, so implications here would be low light shooting, is that correct?
That is so it's low light shooting is the single biggest challenge of these small cameras. They are not good. And they're acceptable for outdoor and evenly lit is the other thing too. Now, okay, and again, there's obviously the other challenge is the size of the lens. The lenses are tiny on here; they're not interchangeable. Whereas the lens on one of these cameras over here, you're talking about a professional quality lens. If you talk to any photographer, they'll always tell you what makes a good quality photo. It's good quality lenses more than anything else. So you can't change the lenses on something like this, so you're limited. Now, again, does it work? Absolutely, yes. And it still has some advantages because remember that this camera over here cannot shoot all the way around. You have to literally take shots all the way, one after the other, and stitch them together to make a 360. This shoots all the way around in one shot. So in times and places where you have no other choice but to grab everything in a single instance, this is the better choice. All right. But if you're trying to get low light, don't expect miracles from this. Okay. It's just not going to happen. Okay. Another camera that I use, just to give you an idea, this is my primary rig. It looks very similar to the other one. This is a standard 360 camera rig that's used for doing virtual tours. And the way that I shoot is by using, it's a Canon EOS R, it's 30 megapixels, a little bit higher resolution than the other camera. But I'm using a fisheye lens on this, which covers 180 degrees up and down. All right, so just about sees, like literally, I'll show you the tripod, it literally slices along the edge of the tripod. So you just about see the edge of the tripod because it's on a slight angle of 7.5 degrees so that it picks up and covers the ceiling. And I take 4 shots all the way around. And with these 4 shots, I'm actually getting roughly about 14 megapixels. 14K, not 14 megapixels. It's 100 megapixels, which is 14K. So with this camera, I'm able to achieve 100 megapixels with a large sensor, right? Which means I'm gathering a lot more light. Control what's actually in each one of the scenes because I'm only shooting one angle at a time. And what that means is that we talked about hiding the crew. That's how you hide the crew. How do you hide the crew with something like this? You can't, right? You got to step out of the room. Whereas this, you can actually quite easily just shoot and always stay behind. The other thing too is if you need to direct people in the scene, what you can actually do with this one over here is talk to the people. So if you were actually being photographed, if I was taking a picture of you guys right now, if you were actually with me, I'd be able to say, can you actually smile a little bit more? This is supposed to be a happy moment. Or can I get you to actually look a little more frustrated because it's a scene where you're trying to do some training where people are frustrated. Okay, we can do that. I can hide I don't have to hide somewhere in another room and try to direct you from somewhere else. So those are some
question, Mark. Sorry, just come through in the chat for us. Question here from Steve. There's such a big difference in cost between off-the-shelf cheap cameras and your nice camera. Do you have recommendations for best of both world scenarios?
Best of both worlds is actually to start with there's a limit to how far down that line we can go, really. You don't have to have the highest quality camera body. That's probably the place where you can save a little wee bit. So the other thing too is buy used. Seriously, if you're looking, you'd be surprised how, like, almost, I would say about 50% of the gear I buy secondhand from people who gave it a go and gave up because they found it too hard. Okay, seriously, that's what a lot of the opportunities are. This lens is brand new. This camera is used. That camera is new, but this lens is used. It's just because that, and so that's the best way to find that, happy medium from a cost perspective.
Okay. And just another quick one. Can you talk about the rotary camera holder on the tripod?
Absolutely. Yes, that's actually and I'm glad you brought that up. The rotary holders that I use are primarily from a brand called Nodal Ninja, which is why part of the reason why people refer to these as the nodal points is because of this one company that makes a lot of these, what they're called as rotators. Okay. Now, these rotators are specifically built so that, and I'll actually bring this a bit closer so that you can see that I'm not actually mounting the camera to the camera to the tripod. It's the lens, and the reason being is this particular spot on the lens is where the no parallax point is. Remember I was saying about things? Yeah. The no parallax point in this lens is right here. So when I'm actually rotating, everything in the scene stays in exactly the same spot.
Yep.
Okay. If you cannot achieve this, you cannot get 360 content that's actually going to stitch properly. Your stitching software will just fail. Okay.
Yep. That's a
all
good
right.
point.
Okay. So from a cost perspective point of view, you're looking at these kinds of heads are in the $500 to $600 ballpark in Australian dollars. So probably about $350, $400 in the States for one of these heads. And the other thing too is you really want to make sure you've got a really strong, stable tripod. That's another one of the expenses you have to have. Make sure that you don't skimp on that. Weight is your friend to some degree. So a heavy tripod, because it stops it from wobbling. And you also want to have the capacity, like in this case, to be able to level the camera. You'll notice that I'm actually moving the camera in multiple angles so that, and there's a ball level in here. And what you want to make sure you do is level the camera 100%, because when it comes to stitching the images, your horizon will be nice and straight. Otherwise, you got all these crazy horizons going sideways, and you then have to try to fix that in post-production. So save yourself the work. One of the basic rules of any photography is always get it right in camera, and you save yourself in post. Okay. So that's essentially how you shoot these images. The other thing too is you'll notice that I've actually got a remote control on here. This is one of the other things you have to have, is you don't want to be touching the camera when you're shooting, especially if you're going to be shooting long exposures, which you often do in 360. Which basically that does is it allows me to grab a remote control and activate the camera from a distance. And this way, if I do need to get out of the way or be out of the scene, you know, maybe I'm causing some shadows where I'm standing, and that's going to show up because there's a light behind me. I need to step away from that. That's one way to solve that. And the other thing too is you don't touch the camera so that you don't shake it, and therefore you end up with sharper images. So remote controls, absolutely the critical piece of equipment. All right. So that covers sort of on a basis of basic gear, what you have to be looking at. So you need camera body, you need fisheye lenses. If you're going to try to shoot with regular lenses, good luck. Your images are going to be huge. They'll probably look great, but you'll spend way too much time in the production to be able to actually, because you remember what the ideal at maximum is about 16K. Anything less than about 8K, and you start to really notice the difference. That's sort of my waddle line is I just simply don't publish content less than 8K unless it's absolutely necessary. Okay. All right. So I'm just going to go back to the presentation now, if I can. Oh, not that one. It should be. Hang on. Let's go back. Ah, here it is. Okay, here we are. So other cameras that are available in this space to get into it, and I'm showing just sort of a variety over here. Matterport. Most people who are familiar with 360 are actually familiar probably more with Matterport content than just about any other content outside of Google Street View. The Google Street View system is shot with a camera that looks a little bit like the one next to it, the Titan, the 360 Titan, but it's actually Google's own technology. Going back to the Matterport, Matterport is primarily focused in the real estate space. They're the ones, whenever you're shopping for a house and you see a 360 tour, very often shot with a Matterport. By the way, it's not a 360 proper spherical camera. It's a cylindrical camera, which means that it does not capture looking straight down or straight up. So if you put that Matterport camera in the middle of a room and there's a beautiful chandelier just above you, or a sprinkler that is part of the LMS requirements for showing where all the sprinklers are, you're not going to see it. So do I recommend Matterport? Probably not. It's just not, it's, you know, it's a horses for courses thing. Use the right equipment. Matterport is really, really ideal for those people shooting virtual tours who don't have a lot of experience and need to publish quickly and use somebody else's platform. And the other thing too is you won't be using Facilitate's platform if you're shooting Matterport, because they have their own platform. And,
correct. Yeah.
yes, it's a different world, but that's one of the ones it needs to be brought up because it's just a well-known one. The Titan 360 is a proper 3D camera. And the reason that's why I bring it up into this set is simply so that you're aware of what this looks like. That's about if I remember right, I think it's about a $26,000 camera. And that's just the camera. Now, remember, we're still talking about, you still need all your microphones for if you're doing video in 360, you need all the mics. You're going to need the tripod. You're going to need extra batteries. You need several memory cards because each one of the cameras inside there needs a separate memory card. And then you've got to learn how to stitch all this stuff. So not easy, okay? So this is getting into the high end. For those who are sort of money no object, want the absolute best, and they really need to capture things at the top end of the game, the Titan would be an example. The reason why I've put the Insta360 RS 1-inch on the screen is because it's actually call it big brother, step up from the 1X3 that I was showing you earlier from Insta360. And if you're primarily focused on doing video, that's the one I recommend people buy. If you're also looking at doing photo and you don't mind lower resolution images, but deal with low light situations, that particular camera has a 1-inch sensor, which is twice the size of the sensor in the X3, which is really the consumer model. Pros and cons again, this particular camera, the RS 1-inch, is water resistant, whereas the X3 is waterproof to 10 meters. So if you actually had to do underwater type work, not that many people do that, I'm sure, but some probably do, then the X3 is the right way to go. So again, look at your needs, look at your production processes, think of what you're going to be looking at from a point of view, how and where you're going to use the camera. And it would be remiss of me not to include Ricoh in the list, which is why I've included this camera, the Ricoh Theta X. Ricoh is probably the most popular company in the 360 space. They have also a model Z or Z, depending on which part of the world you're from, that shoots great 3Ks for basically the real estate space. And so it's very similar to the RS 1-inch edition. They're very similar in terms of their quality and pricing. And so you're looking at roughly, I think it's 1,300 Australian dollars for the for the RS 1-inch edition. Okay, right. So these are all examples of cameras, and of course the list can go on and on and on. If I had to show you every 360 camera there is, we'd be here just talking about just different models, and that really is, I think, a lot less important than really the process of capture. But then it would be so going back through this again. I think we've covered most of that already. Yeah, there's other brands. GoPro make them. Xiaomi makes them. There's a lot of different models. But I still think that if you're trying to consider, you're considering which way you should go. Should I go give this a go, and I don't want to spend a lot of money? What do I recommend as a starting point? The Insta360 brand and product is probably the easiest to start with. And the next step up from there, generally speaking, will be going to a DSLR or mirrorless camera with a fisheye lens.
Yeah.
Okay.
Excellent.
All right. We talked about tripods, monopods, mounting kits. We've done lighting. I'm going to touch on that very briefly. Remember that it's very difficult to control lighting in the 360 space. You have to deal with what you're dealing with. The solution to lighting in photo and photography is to shoot what's called bracketed images. That means you're shooting 3 photos or 5 or even 7 photos in some situations of the same scene at different brightness levels by using your shutter speed, so either slower or faster, slower and faster. And what you do is you actually blend all those images together to create something called HDR, or high dynamic range. What that allows you to do is essentially mimic what the human eye can see. Can you do that with the little 360 cameras? Yeah, you can, but there's some limitations. Number one, the sensor is still really small and it has very little ability to gather light. Whereas with a more modern DSLR or mirrorless camera, you can get a much better looking image, have much better lighting, and the number of brackets you require will reduce, therefore reducing your workflow. So in some ways, using a 360, a DSLR will actually take you less time because you're getting it right in the camera. Okay. Again, lenses, we talked about that. There's one of the things you'll find is that lenses for 360 work is a topic all of its own. Actually, I could do a 3-hour session on just lenses alone. But it comes down to that probably the most common and popular lens that I know of in the DSLR space is the Canon 8 to 15 fisheye. It's an 8mm to 15mm zoom lens. And the beauty behind that is that you can use it on crop sensor bodies and full frame sensor bodies, which means basically the less expensive Canon bodies that you buy that are consumer versus professional, it'll work on both. You have to think about power too. Remember that shooting a lot of virtual tours and shooting a lot of content means that you don't show up without having extra batteries. So you've got to make sure you're ready with that. And make sure that if you are running power lines for lighting, that you hide your power lines, because otherwise you're going to be spending a lot of time in post-production photoshopping that stuff out. Next, obviously, is data. These images are absolutely huge. The images that I shoot now are basically that with the 30 megapixel body basically creates about a 30 megabyte file. And if I'm shooting brackets, I'm shooting at least 3, so times 3. Then I've got to shoot all the way around 4 shots, so times 4. Then I got to convert those images into what's called a TIFF file. So you go from a raw photo, because you don't shoot in JPEG if you want good quality. You're always shooting in raw images. That means that you're going to take it another step up in terms of size, because TIFF files are larger than raw files. So where are you going to store all of this? You have to think in terms of your data backup. Your storage and data backup. I've got 35 terabytes worth of data on my drive, and I'm running out of room. Just gives you an idea how fast. I've been shooting for about 8 years now, and I'm constantly basically having to buy more and more backup drives, and just to store it. So that's a big thing. And the last thing you want to do is have that much data, have a virtual tour, basically as files disappear and you don't have a backup. So make sure you also have a backup, which means planning in terms of your costs of having offsite backup. Personally, right now, what I'm using is a service called sync.com, and it allows me to have unlimited drive storage offsite for backups. And of course, then you got to think about bags, boxes, carrying stuff. You're doing this at a premise, right? So you got to carry this stuff. So remember, you got more expenses there to think about, to plan for, but make sure that you protect your equipment. There's no point in buying all this expensive equipment and not protecting it properly. One of the things that I recommend doing with the small Insta360 cameras is buy the little lens covers for them, because those lenses, exposed as they are, scratch very easily. For the extra 35 bucks or whatever it costs, get the little plastic lens covers that go on top of the lens, and this over here, if you scratch that, you just peel it off, put a new one on. Okay. All right. So how do you edit all this stuff? So now we've actually talked about capture, but what do you do with all this stuff? Well, you got to start doing something with it. Some people will just use their mobile phone for like the Insta360 or One RS. You can do a little bit of basic editing with your mobile phone. It's very limited. There's apps that come directly from Insta360. You can do, again, the same thing with the tablet, a little easier because at least the screen's bigger. But by far the most common way for editing 360 content, whether it be photo or video, is going to be a big workhorse of a computer. You're talking about something that's got big GPUs. You're talking about computers that have basically, a typical gaming computer if you're in a PC world. Most of the photographers that I know that are using Apple tend to be more in the Mac Studio space. So you're not, can you get away with a small MacBook Air? Yeah, you can. But what happens is that being that the images are so large, when you go to export the images or when you're importing them, it's just a lot slower. You're just creating a lot more work for yourself, and you're going to slow yourself down, and you probably get really frustrated. So the added expense of buying a faster computer goes a long, long way in saving a huge amount of time. All right. And the other thing too, of course, is if you're doing this professionally, you want to make sure that you've got computer screens that are color corrected. Nothing worse than creating a virtual tour that you publish or 360 content, and it looks a bit yellow, or it looks a little bit blue. Why? Because, well, maybe you shot with the wrong white balance on your camera, and now it's all wrong. Well, how do you fix that? Well, you fix it in post-production, but if you can't see because the colors are wrong on your screen, well, that's a problem. So you got to make sure that you've got some good screens. And the reason why I say 2 to 3 screens are necessary is because usually when you're editing in 360, you're going to have most likely one screen that you use for putting all of your files on it. So you're grabbing and dragging them, dropping them in the right place. And then a screen that's specifically just dedicated for seeing the imagery itself. Because remember, these images are really big, and you're going to be zooming in to see what they look like to make sure they look good. So don't skip on your screen. It's worth your while. I'm using currently my editing screens are 2 32-inch and one 34-inch, and all 4K. So it gives you an idea what I'm using right now. As far as the editing software, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on there, but you're going to be dealing with the app that comes with Insta 360 if you're using their stuff. But then DaVinci Resolve and Adobe Premiere are probably the most common video editing apps out there. And this is something you guys can tell me, Ben. I don't know if you actually do a lot of Blender work. Is that something that you guys consume or use in your space?
We do use it, I think, a little bit, but no, not too much.
Yeah. For the vast majority, DaVinci Resolve and Adobe Premiere, and it's not just the program on itself. You have to use special plugins that'll allow you to import, edit, and export 360 content. So again, the learning curve there from an editing perspective can be quite long. So be aware that just because you can capture it, you still have to be able to edit it and produce a final product. So in some cases, what people will do, and I have had this done on several occasions, and I work with other content creators, where someone else shoots it, they send it to me, and I do the editing and then ship it back as a final product. So that can take at least one of the steps out of the process.
Mark, quick question. Would you recommend log mode filming?
For like C-Log, that kind of thing for camera, it's a yes and no thing. Yes, it's better because you'll get better dynamic range in video. So yes, that's a more technical question, obviously. Someone who obviously knows their way around the space. But you have to think in terms of how much extra work you're adding to the process. If you've got the chops and you've got the gear, by all means, go to town with it. But remember that you are adding an extra step in the workflow to get a better result. How much better result it is more dependent on what the needs are of the project. Now, you're not going to be shooting in log if you're using an Insta 360 unless you're getting into the, like the Titans and stuff like that. But with, I think that would I do it? I would only do it if it was like seriously like money no object type client.
Cool.
Okay.
And another one, is there any difference in export times? Not quite sure what that's referring to. Was it maybe export times?
We need a little clarification as to what we mean.
Yeah. So Danny, can you just provide a little bit more clarification on that, and we can ask that again? Yeah, thanks.
We'll come back to that, and I'll definitely answer that. In the photo editing space, the way that I do my editing in photo is I tend to, because I primarily don't shoot with one-shot cameras unless absolutely necessary. I use a combination of Photoshop and Affinity Photo. And I used to use Lightroom, but I don't anymore. So what I do is I import my images into basically as raw files onto my computer. And then I use Adobe Camera Raw with a preset for all the 360 photos. And I have a standardized process so that I can do this effectively, efficiently, so that, my white balance is corrected, my shadows and highlights are corrected, all of those things are done. And every single image is processed exactly the same way initially. And then I export all those images, and then I put them through PT GUI Pro. If you are interested in doing 360 stills work and you want to stitch your images from a DSLR or mirrorless perspective, you pretty well have to use PT GUI Pro. I mean, there are some, I put on some, I think Infuse and Huggin might even be free. But they're nowhere as precise. So you will end up with stitching problems. Like one of my favorite things to point out is if you look straight up on the average virtual tour, and if there's anything that's got lines in the ceiling or like power lines outside, they don't match up. And it looks kind of funny and it's kind of weird. You know, after a while, you see a lot of these stitching errors and it gets very, very distracting. So having properly stitched images makes a big, big difference. And that requires using software that, like PTGUI Pro, and its skill, if you wish, or its specialty, is it uses points on every one of the images as you shoot them, when you stitch them together, to say that's exactly the same spot. So you might have the corner of a building in one shot, and you turn and you take your next shot, the corner of the building in the next shot, it knows basically that's the same corner. So it will line things up perfectly. So that's why PTGUI Pro. So go through Photoshop, create some TIFF images that I can actually edit, put them through PTGUI Pro, turn them into a 360 photo. So now it's a full spherical image. Then I put them through Affinity Photo, because with Affinity Photo, similar to Photoshop, it's the easiest I've found to do editing live inside of a 360. It's a fantastic program, and a lot of people are using that in place or instead of Photoshop, and with very good reason. It's just as powerful as Photoshop in many respects, but I use it specifically because of its capabilities in 360 editing. It actually has a live view for 360 photos. So for example, it might even be where there was a car driving by in the scene, and I accidentally didn't realize that there was half the car was in the shot and the other, and I turned the camera and took the next shot and the car is gone. Well, that means that half car I've got to remove somehow. So if I'm going to Photoshop that out, I'll use Affinity Photo for that. So it's just a better tool for, for basically doing those types of edits. And that's also a great place for doing, go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just saying we've got 5 minutes left. So
yep. Okay,
see how
let's race through over here.
Mm.
Yes, well, we're pretty well at the end now. So
okay.
When it comes to publishing, obviously, I'm going to recommend Facilitate, right? That's pretty obvious. Now, I primarily publish on Google Maps and Street View, and I create virtual tours that are on alternative platforms. There's places like Kula and Go Through and all these other ones that I use. But in your space, if you're using it for LMS type environment or for learning management, I think that the Facilitate platform is 100% fully capable of actually handling what you throw at it. But publishing is the last step. And if you can't get that right, you haven't got a product yet. You've done everything but the thing that actually allows people to use the content. So it's incredibly important to make sure you get to that point. Okay. And obviously reach out to the Facilitate people to make sure that when it comes to any questions with regards to the software, they're the ones to help you with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. And when it comes to the implementation, this is sort of coming back to the beginning. Remember that the objective here is always to have good planning, right? Think ahead about what your project is going to look like. Remember that in the end, no matter what, if you don't actually have good imagery, the idea behind the imagery should be not to distract and to simply get out of the way. That's what the images should do. They should get out of the way. The content should get out of the way of what you're trying to accomplish. And when people immerse themselves in 360, essentially they begin the process of forgetting where they are, which is what you want, because then they're actually thinking about the final outcome. So really the user experience, comes down to that level of engagement. All right. So that's it from a point of view of what I wanted to cover for now. I can basically, what can I offer? Obviously, if people want training on how to take photos, I'm happy to provide that. On-site consultations, even video consultations, where somebody does a walkthrough of a premise and say, hey, how would you shoot this if you were here in person, or even in site. My favorite way of actually doing consultations is in person, where we go for a walk, we see the place, we look at the lighting, we look at the environment, we look at the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, and come up with a plan from there. I do offer for people who want to do the UCapture third-party edit, I can do that, and I can also recommend that as a way of handling it if it goes into the too hard basket, because the editing is a big part of the process. And I'm also available for hire if need be.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. We've just got a couple of more questions coming in, so we might jump straight into them. In terms of the export times, the question was, after video editing some 360 video in, say, Premiere Pro or other video editing software, is there any real difference in export times as compared to 2D video?
Yes. Yes. It's, you're talking, think of it as basically you've got two full streams of video content. You're dealing with also the issue that if you've got two streams of content, you've also got the issue that if they're not perfectly timed, right, it's going to throw your eyes out. So you're spending a lot more time making sure you got absolutely everything right. It's just a lot more work. I usually, if I was to price out a 3D job versus a 2D job, I'd be going about tenfold time. That much. So yeah, so it's a huge difference.
Cool. And another one, I'm not sure if we got any idea on this one. Can I publish Insta360 video to Rise for use in our LMS? So you might not. Sure. Gee, I don't know about that one either. Not 100% familiar with that LMS platform and whether it'll take 360 video or not. Possibly.
Just use Facilitate. They're there.
Yeah, of course. That's the default answer. Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
No, good. Another one here, lighting has been an issue for me for 360 video, particularly strobing. Do you have recommended lighting types, e.g. LED lighting? I have a filter that I apply in Premiere Pro, but it's not foolproof.
No, absolutely. Natural light is number one if you can, because actually, if you can, using it, this sounds terrible, but incandescent light is easier to manage because it doesn't flicker. You gotta remember the LED lights, the way you dim or control LED lights is by flashing them. Well, immediately you're creating a flash problem.
Creating a strobe, yeah.
Just creating a strobe, exactly. So I do recommend really as much as possible if you can. The other thing is adapt by increasing your aperture. Possibly, so, and the other thing too is use larger sensor camera equipment if you can, because that'll actually give you more dynamic range. And by having more dynamic range, you can bring the light, you can basically shoot in a slightly dark and bring it back up in post.
Cool. So let me just quickly share my screen again. So that's it. Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Mark. We've got time for a couple more questions. I know we've gone a little bit over, but if there is anything, please just throw it in the chat now. I will pop out just the last poll question. I know we've gone a little bit over, but if people can indulge me a little bit, I'll just pop this one out. So that's the question there. So looking a little bit about how your confidence is overall, maybe in response to this webinar or just in general about filming 360. That'd be good to get a bit of a sense. And also, guys, if there's any other thoughts around what you'd like to see in this space in 360 imagery capture as another webinar topic, then just pop that in the chat as well before you go, and we can, as we said, we can maybe get Mark back and take a bit of a deep dive on certain areas. So,
most of the train, and by the way, if something, when it comes to comparing cameras or equipment, there's tons and tons of great content on YouTube that you can research out. Especially at the consumer level. At the professional level, there's a little bit less, actually a lot less. But I don't expect that most people will be going out and buying full DSLR kits and doing it themselves for the most part. Just the investment and time in production for most is just not worth their while. It's easier just to hire it out because
that's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. One more question here. Do you have any recommendations for first-person point of view filming?
A little bit more context would be helpful, but if I'm thinking in terms of first person, where you're saying you're actually filming yourself, the question then becomes is this video, is this photo, is this in 360, is this is it indoor, is it outdoor? There's a whole heap of different things to put into consideration. For one, I will say always make sure that you position yourself such that the light is on you, but that you also try, if you're doing it outdoors, try to do it on a cloudy day, because the world's greatest softbox to create beautiful light is a cloudy day, right? So awesome. This is what we hear, you don't have any shadows on the ground to deal with, and you don't have shadows on people's faces. So that helps an awful lot, making it so that the scene stays reasonably consistent. The other thing too is do it at a time, the other thing is to do it at times of day where lighting will actually be beneficial, which is sometimes before sunrise, after sunset, but that means you deal with less light. But then you've got beautiful light. But then you've got to make sure that you're also considering shadows, because then the shadows are very, very long. Sometimes you can actually use that to your advantage. Like if you're shooting next to a building outside, then what you can do is put yourself in shadow in the in the shadow of the building. And if you're shooting for half an hour and the sun hasn't shifted enough to get into a spot where it doesn't look great, then you've leveraged the environment. It's photography
absolutely.
skills is really what we're talking about at that point in time, content creation skills.
That's right, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. Okay, cool. Well, we're definitely out of time now, so I won't hold anyone up. Look, here are the details for both Marc and us at Facilitate. So if there's anything we can help you with in this space, feel free to reach out.
Yeah,
thank you all very much for attending, and big thank you to Marc for sharing some of his knowledge with us today. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. Really appreciate it. And again, feel free to reach out if you've got questions. But I do highly recommend that you do, and it's probably best that you reach out through Facilitate, since they're the host of this event, so to make sure, because chances are you'll be wanting to use it in that context on that platform. So there's always going to be conditions that need to be met to make sure that it works for their LMS.
Yep. No, absolutely.
Cool.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We'll leave it there. And for those of you who didn't make it, you wouldn't be hearing this, but we'll share this as a link if you want to review it as well. So we'll get that out by tomorrow, I would have thought. So thank you very much, and have a great day.